Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. My name is Philip Eidson, and I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement. And I'm joined by my co-founder to help facilitate and tag team today's conversation by Kelly Barner. So, Kelly, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely, Phil. Glad to be here for this conversation.
Yeah, this one is one where, it's funny, we were just talking backstage that the challenge will be to keep this to an hour. We could probably do a couple of hours for today's conversation. Now, if you are new to the AOP Live format, I just want to remind you that it is all conversation. We have a single slide, which we're going to actually bring up on screen a few moments into the conversation. But it's really all about questions. We've got our own questions to ask for today's guests, but we certainly encourage you to put any questions, any comments, any observations that you might have in the chat window and the side panel. There's also a Q&A tab as well. We'll be keeping an eye on both the Q&A tab and the chat box as we go through the conversation. Now, today, the topic we titled this as Redefining Procurement's Value and Shifting Mindsets. So procurement's always been asked to take on more types of responsibilities. That's nothing new. We're always hearing about doing more and doing more with less. But the value proposition still isn't always clearly understood outside of procurement. So we're going to look at that challenge today in the light of the Hackett Group's 2023 Procurement Value Measurement Study. Now, our guests who we're about to bring on stage are both, if you've listened and been a part of Art of Procurement events and podcasts in the past, they'll need no introduction. We will be speaking with Chris Sawchuk. Chris is the Principal and Global Procurement Advisory Practice Leader at the Hackett Group, and Vishal Patel, the VP of Product Marketing at Ivalua. So without further ado, because we have so much to get through, let's bring Chris and Vishal on stage. Here we go. Hey, Chris. Hey, Vishal. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Hi, guys. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, I have to make note of your Love Procurement shirt that you have going on there. So I know that we have a special prize for some attendees today. So why don't you kind of explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So Love Procurement, it's something we kind of started a few years ago. And we actually started it by getting some actual quotes from customers and people in the industry on why they love procurement. And actually, we have those in, in nice little design posters and stuff like that. So the next logical step was to create a T-shirt. And those are very popular at events, as you can imagine. I have the winter edition, the sweatshirt.
Yeah, I'm liking the look of that.
But today, we're gonna give away, I believe, three T-shirts to random attendees of today's webinar. And hopefully we can easily figure out who those are and send you the T-shirts.
And we'll get some modeling by the winners done afterwards on social media. I think I should have worn mine as well. I'm kicking myself not. I've come in standard AOP garb, and I think we need to get Chris one as well.
Sure.
Chris, I'm not sure if Chris, how Chris responds to that one, but so let's go into the conversation. And Vishal, I'm going to start with a question for you. Procurement's always changing, and not least because of technology, and technology's been at the forefront of really a lot of conversations in procurement for a number of years now. And I just wondered if you can talk about how externally driven changes like that different from what actually we're going to talk about today, which is the shifting mindsets piece.
Yeah, sure. So, I think external drivers are something that has grown the procurement function and has continued to make it more relevant over the last few years, especially over the last few years. And it's things like risk and inflation and resilience and protecting margins and all those things that add to the list of things procurement has to do. And that's generally what we tend to talk about sort of in the industry. But today, the purpose was to really take more of an internal look. And given all those things that procurement is doing, it seems, and it obviously isn't the case in every organization, but it does seem that a lot of that work sometimes tends to go unnoticed or undervalued, or is boiled down to that one, bottom line savings number. And the truth is that procurement's involved in a lot. So I think today's discussion was to really, talk about like how do you communicate all that other value? How do you share it? How do you align it with expectations of what procurement should be doing and is doing? So I think those were the different aspects for today's call.
And that kind of segues into the Hackett Group's 2023 Procurement Value Measurement Study. And Chris, could you talk a little bit about the study itself and the overarching messages that came out of the research?
Yeah, certainly. And to carry on with what Vishal was highlighting is that the whole premise of the study was to really get a view of how are we valuing procurement and the contributions that supply management is making in our organizations. And we felt it was a good time to do the study. The study that that we're going to talk about, is a study that we conducted several months ago. Mm-hmm. And if you look back over the last several years, really starting in 2019, there's a way, and I would say there's certain decisions and criteria that we utilize to make decisions in terms of how we architect our supply chains, our supply bases, our supply networks. And, a lot of it, and probably not surprising, a lot of the weighting was on cost. Mm-hmm. And so we've gone through a series of disruptions over the last several years, starting with COVID, the Ukraine-Russian war, and so on, the Texas freeze, all of these supply disruptions. And not only did it elevate, supply management and the importance of it, not only to society and our economies, but to the companies. And so we've seen this. And so one of the things that we really wanted to uncover is, are we seeing some changes in terms of how procurement is actually being valued? And one of the things that we are looking at in supply management in those organizations, not only, is it more elevated in terms of its value contributions, what are we looking at as additional value contributions beyond things such as savings, which has been traditional for a long period of time? But also, how are we tracking it? And the credibility of that tracking, have we seen changes in that as well? And we certainly have in all of these different areas as a result of this study.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're definitely going to get into some of the details. I was just looking at some of the topics we're going to be covering. We're going to be talking about procurement's impact, risk management. We'll be talking about savings, but also on AI. And I think we can't get away from the AI conversation at the moment. It's certainly omnipresent in the procurement space. And so we did a snap poll on LinkedIn just before this webinar, just so we could kind of get the perspectives on AI right now from the AOP community. And so I'm just going to read this out for anybody who's listening rather than watching and who can't see the slide. We asked the question, what are your current thoughts or feelings about the meaningful application of generative AI in procurement? And so the number one answer, we were able to give four answers or four different options on the LinkedIn poll. The top answer with 58% of respondents, so overwhelmingly the most popular answer, is that generative AI will be positively impactful for procurement. 18% responded, I'm just not sure. 16% said it will lead to job loss. And 7% said, we don't have time to evaluate it. Chris, I'm going to ask you first, just based on some of the research you do as well. And then Vishal, I'll come to you for your perspective. But did this surprise you, or is this in line with what you were expecting to see?
It's fairly in line. I'll give you a perspective. We did a study, and we haven't published it yet. It's our annual study. We call it our Key Issues, Key Priority Study in Supply Management and Procurement. And it's a study that we've been running for over 15 years. One of the questions that we added this year, because of all of the awareness around not just AI, but generative AI, was a question specifically on generative AI. And the first question that we asked is, are you engaging? Have you started to evaluate and engage in looking at generative AI within the environment, your supply management procurement environment? And the results we got back, I would say, it's not the exact same question, but it was
Mhm.
50-50. 50%
Right.
saying we haven't done anything. We haven't really started to evaluate it. It doesn't mean these companies aren't evaluating in the broader company, but they haven't started to evaluate its impact and how it could be utilized, use cases, et cetera, within the supply management procurement environment. And 50% said they did, roughly.
Mhm.
But the other thing that we asked about is if you are evaluating, you are considering what generative AI specifically can impact your organization, what are the areas that you believe that they could have the biggest impact? And two areas, number 1 and 2, were spend analytics. Number
Right.
2 was around contract lifecycle management. And
Yeah.
we've done several studies, and it continues to come up in those two particular areas. But I think it's an interesting, and I think the one that's interesting here is the 16%, where it will lead to job loss. We published a research paper about a month or two ago, and it was not specific to procurement, but it was specific to the entire business services organization within a company. This would include finance and IT and HR, et cetera. And we highlighted a potential for a 40% reduction in the staffing that's currently utilized in all of these different areas over the next 5 to 7 years. And it was interesting because we got a lot of folks that came back to us and just didn't want to agree with that. But what happened was there's other research organizations that came out with similar studies with similar numbers, but actually shorter timeframes. One of the things that's interesting is you have to look at the various areas. Like marketing was one of the areas that we highlighted as having more of a near-term impact. Procurement and supply management was one of the areas that we didn't see these impacts occurring until later in that 5 to 7 year period of time. And partly, there's a lot of creative work that procurement organizations do that will be significantly enhanced or enabled through generative AI over time.
It's interesting to hear that procurement, while that's a pretty eye-opening number, 40%, that procurement is not necessarily the first to fall, so to speak, which actually then gives procurement leaders the opportunity to figure out how to best take advantage of generative AI, as opposed to it being immediately impacted by a huge swathe of cuts, which potentially, by the sound of your research, is going to happen to other areas of the business, or has the potential to happen to other areas of the business.
Well, I think it's important to understand is that I think a lot of folks, all we did is we just looked at current activities.
Yeah.
We said if we applied these types of things, and we actually did it from a grounds up, we looked at every single process that procurement does, and we asked ourselves, if you were to apply specifically generative AI capabilities here, what might be the impact? Now, that wasn't the same across all areas, but you look at that on a process by process, sub process by sub process, view, and then you build it up to an overall number. Now, what I look at and what doesn't account in those numbers, and because you can't just look at it 40%, say, hey, 100 people in procurement today, I'm going to have 60 people in 5 to 7 years. No, that's not the way it works. What it works is you're just looking at that current activity, because there are activity that we're doing today that will be enabled. And, with that, that's activity that in many ways, we're enabling what we're doing today. But then there's a whole host of activity that we can't get to today. Most organizations I go out to, we're constrained by labor. And so the question is, if I only had more time, I had more people, et cetera, well, this ought to give us ability to go out and go do some of the things that we're not able to do today that are part of the current set of activities. What's not accounted for, and we're going to account for that in future research, is what are we able to do that we're not able to do today? And this is where you're going to see an addition of resources back to the function. Potentially not to make up for the 40%, but it doesn't mean that there won't be new work that's created as a result of this, things that we're not able to do today without this type of technology.
And perhaps things we haven't even had the vision to do yet because we've not even thought about, imagine the art of the possible.
Yeah. I mean, think about, asking yourself, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, but think about it, just a question. If you're sitting there and you're as a company, that company has specific objectives. Could you imagine an environment where you can scenario model the architecture of a supply network based on the objectives of the company? So if a CEO and the executive team comes to you and say, listen, what if we actually created an organization that allowed us to be more cost competitive in the marketplace, or, drove different types of things, considered the risk, et cetera. This is highly complex to model these types of things when you have thousands and tens of thousands of suppliers, et cetera. First, you need all the information. You need all of that data, that intelligence on all the suppliers to even be able to go do this. But once you're able to do that, can you do that kind of scenario modeling and start to architect different structures that allow you to be more competitive in the marketplace? These are possibilities as we look forward.
Now, we were going to talk about AI later in the conversation, but this is a good kind of conversation to dig deep into. Kelly, I wonder if we should take down the slide, and I want to just transition over to Vishal. And there's actually some conversations in the chat around what is Ivalua doing in the generative AI space, because I know that you've kind of built this into your product roadmap and had a launch yesterday. But how do you see AI, especially the context of the results that we asked around where people are thinking, but more generally, how are you taking a look at AI and more specifically generative AI and informing what you're doing from a product perspective?
Yeah, so definitely generative AI is sort of in its own category when it comes to AI technologies, right? So we've done other types of AI technologies, machine learning and NLP and deep learning and so on. But generative AI for sure, because it's so content related, right? So all types of content, text, audio, video, there are lots of applications for it. And our approach has been to build in generative AI, or at least an integration to one of the LLMs out there. So Microsoft Azure OpenAI, the Enterprise Edition, which is more secure. But it's not as simple as just offering OpenAI within the context of a procurement application. It's actually twofold. So one is building certain use cases that are practical and make sense, and I'll go through some of those. And then the second is actually providing the ability to create your own custom use cases, either through the partners or your own organization. And we've seen a couple of companies start to do this on their own without Ivalua. And so now we're offering that ability within the platform. So you can now go and create an entirely new use case that we haven't thought about, but is custom to your own organization. And the reason for that is because it's such a new technology that there's no way Ivalua by ourselves could come up with all the different scenarios. I mean, there are probably hundreds of use cases across SourceBait, if not more. I can tell you, like, in a matter of a few weeks, we created 10 use cases. We think our partners will be able to create, another 50 use cases. And when we make this available to our customers, they'll be able to create hundreds of use cases. And the power is really not like, take this big thing and use generative AI to make it better. I think it's actually the opposite, is like, take all the small things that take you a lot of time to do, like writing an email or summarizing an RFP response, or, creating the basis of an improvement plan.
Writing meeting notes.
Taking notes on a call with a supplier. Like all of those small things, like, they will add up to hundreds of hours of work.
Yeah.
And if you're not having to do that, you're spending your time doing other more useful things, right, as procurement.
Vishal, when you're talking, I'm envisioning, I got my iPhone here. You think about the Apple Store, right? And, there was a time there was no apps out there. You create a device, there's no apps. And in a way, you're following a similar model by saying, you know what, we're going to open it up. That's basically what Apple did. They said, all right, let's open it up for folks to create apps. Now, some of those apps may be similar to each other. You're going to have that. And then, users can say, all right, of these different use cases, these different ones, which one is most effective in my environment? People have their favorites, et cetera. But you could actually see an environment of a store of, generative AI use case, call it apps.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say that, because that's actually the direction we're taking more next year. But we will be sort of creating an add-on store, we call it, where, if, for example, our ecosystem of partners creates their own use cases, whether it's generative AI or other, they will be able to save them in a private or public add-on for others to be able to use and even bring into their own environments if they make sense, right? So that's something that's going to be coming soon. But I think the power of generative AI is again, it's not like, there's a lot of, and I agree, there's probably some use cases for spend analysis and contract management, but like, saying generative AI is going to help me negotiate a contract, it's easy to say that, but it's actually more complicated to make it happen in real life, right? But saying to, can Gen AI give me a red line of a clause compared to all of my previously approved clauses or my master clause library? Yeah, that's a more practical way to do it. But just helping with negotiation, yeah, it can help, but at a very surface level, it's not going to really get into like negotiation tactics yet, anyway. But still, there's still hundreds of hours of work, thousands of hours of work across the procurement team that can be saved. And this is why, so our positioning is that Gen AI can really help supercharge a procurement team. There are some considerations you need to have, and we have some content on that. But yeah, it's definitely an exciting time.
Kelly, any observations from your perspective of the survey results, and then we'll dig into the Hackett research.
Sure. Well, I'll be honest. I was in the 7%. But when I think about, not having time to give more thought to maybe how generative AI can have an impact in procurement, even that doesn't totally capture the full picture, because I think we were among the first people in there. Me selfishly, I think of myself as a writer. So ChatGPT was like, okay, ChatGPT, how serious is this going to get? But it's almost like the faster and the more curious you were to get in there and see what it's capable of, the less baked the idea is, the less discussion you've had an opportunity to listen to. Vishal, you talked about sort of the 10 use cases that you came up with initially. It does take time for all of us to learn enough to think about, okay, I could maybe use that here, I could use it there. It's almost like this might be a variation on the traditional adoption curve, where there was so much enthusiasm right up front before anybody was ready to apply it, before it was totally ready to be rolled out. We're almost going to have to force ourselves to come back around, maybe even the more quickly we were to be interested in it. So it'll be interesting for me to see if, the adoption curve is a little bit different, even when it's embedded in some more familiar procurement processes and technologies. Maybe 2023 will be the year we met ChatGPT and generative AI, and next year will be the year we sort of figured out where it belongs in our ecosystem. But it's definitely going to play a role. I think that much is sure.
Yeah, I think the one last thing I would just say to wrap up here is that it's not perfect, right? We know that with generative AI. And, there's a confidence factor. We've all gone out and used it to generate maybe an RFP or something and say, it's about 40% there, but, it's giving me a head start. What's going to happen over time is that, in this environment, you look at it a co-pilot. People are using that term, Microsoft uses it, et cetera, in terms of, how they sort of is your enabler as you go through. And so it's just a way to augment and enable you as a professional. There does come a time where, the generative AI is, the confidence factor in terms of what its output is, like if it's generating an RFP, that you're now finding that it gets to 99, 99.5, 99.9% accurate. And at that point, this is where, I think people get concerned, is that, yes, the human can come out of the loop. So the idea is we're starting with the human in the loop, the co-pilot kind of model. But there are going to be instances in some of those use cases where, over time that may be excluded, and, where other cases there will be that co-pilot type of situation on a long-term basis.
Yeah, I think, you can be both, will be positively impactful and it will lead to job losses, can both be true. And I think that one of the challenges and opportunities for procurement is that I think it will lead to job losses, but that's in the, when you look at individual team sizes being smaller. However, the impact that procurement can drive will be greater than the impact that procurement can drive today. So the question is, are we able to broaden the reach of strategic procurement to more organizations to see the value proposition? So net from a profession perspective, that there isn't necessarily that huge big drop of jobs. It's just that they're spread more broadly across a wider number of organizations.
And I think some of that also is due not only because of the delay, it's also due to the fact that within a company, organizations, I have a number of clients that are saying, hey, yeah, we are applying generative AI, but it's in other parts of the company. We're sort of on a waiting list until we get to the point where we're going to start to explore it within our area of supply management going forward. So that is causing a little bit of delay, in terms of where it is actually being applied within the company.
Now, we said at the very beginning we could probably have a conversation that would take a couple of hours. Let's dig into the procurement's impact and the value proposition from the research of this study that you did, Chris. Is procurement getting any more sophisticated about our approach to measuring ROI, or are we still, really just resting on this was our year-over-year cost savings?
When you think about ROI, ROI is interesting, and we at Hackett, we track an ROI, and it's the way we quantify it is either cost reduction or cost reduction plus cost avoidance divided by the overall investment in procurement. And when you think about the overall investment in procurement, we're looking at all of the staff that you have, your labor costs, fully loaded. We're looking at outsourcing if you happen to have a third party helping with some of that activity. You're looking at your technology investments and other costs as well, costs to travel to see suppliers, et cetera. There's a lot of costs that go into that. And, the challenges, and so you're asking about, have we gotten more sophisticated? I think we've become more sophisticated in the way that we think about value, but not necessarily in terms of quantifying it. So when we look at sort of the traditional ROI, it's difficult to quantify some of these other value elements of what we do in a way that we have been able to do in terms of cost savings and cost avoidance. So even those are even challenged even to today. So I would say that there's one thing, and have we gotten more sophisticated? I would say yes. Have we been able to quantify it? Not as much. But I also believe there's a broader thinking in terms of looking at ROI. Years ago, organizations didn't look at ROI. We looked at them separately. We looked at the budgets that we have as organizations, and we looked at the value that we create, in terms of savings, et cetera. And typically, as a procurement leader, you would be given or jointly developed these two objectives. What are we going to invest? What's your budget going to be? And then what are you expecting to deliver back to the organization? But we never combine them. And when we combine them, this is where we can look at things much more holistically in what I call an ROI. And I think what we're finding today, more organizations are looking at it that way than what we saw, say, 5 years ago.
Okay. How much of the cost to serve for procurement is under the microscope? Do you see that that's ever more challenging, or that there's more kind of focus on that? Because I see a lot of, when you look at priorities, it's often not necessarily, well, of course, cost savings, external cost savings is a big focus, but oftentimes I see in the Hackett report around the cost of procurement, the operational cost to deliver procurement. Is that getting even more scrutiny?
From a procurement standpoint, overall, not as much. Okay. And I'll tell you why. When we look at, because we look at things broader than procurement as a firm, we look at the entire G&A infrastructure. And when you look at the G&A infrastructure of a company, you include IT, you include finance, human resources, procurement, et cetera. And when you look at that entire stack, the thinnest budget area in that is procurement. So it's not under the microscope as much as other functions. IT is the biggest area. So you're going to find, if you're going to try to drive costs out, especially in the current environment, procurement's probably not going to be the place you're going to start, because there's just not a lot as much there as you can get out of some other areas. At the same time, especially when we go into more difficult economic times, is this the area that you really want to be cost cutting? I mean, in many ways, it's part of the solution than the problem. And so we want to be cutting out and reducing costs in an area that can potentially help us generate additional value during these difficult periods of time. And as what we've seen over this entire year, we've shifted from an inflationary focused organization. How do we deal with mitigating these increases, from 2021, 2022? You still have that in certain areas, but we've shifted significantly to cost. And that's actually what we saw. We haven't published it yet, our 2024 key issues and priority study, but something that we haven't seen over the last couple of years, cost has not been our top priority.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? 2024, it's back at the top.
Yeah.
Vishal, is that what you're seeing as well when, from your client base?
Yeah, I mean, so back to your original question on like the sort of cost of procurement.
Yeah.
I think people, it's an interesting mix, because for us as a technology provider, we fall into the bucket of a IT cost for a company, but also the bucket of the procurement cost, or I don't know if it depends on how it's kind of measured, but
where the budget sits.
Yeah, where the budget sits, right? So so that's an interesting one. But in terms of importance of cost, I mean, I think definitely the last year and probably even into next year, there's probably still an expectation that you need to deliver on cost objectives, cost containment objectives. And some of the supply resilience, supply risk things have come down, but then you have all these new areas which, if you're a company operating in Europe, then you're now having to be concerned about sustainability regulation quite a lot. And it's if you're a global company, then there are regulations coming over the next couple of years in various parts of the world that will require to change how you work or the information you gather from your suppliers. I don't see a way around it, right? There's some requirements around carbon tax, for example, if you're importing things from another country into Europe, that's going to be applied to everybody, I think, at the end of next year or beginning of the 25. But those are things that require changes and they require solutions, right? And it's I think it's on procurement to kind of come up with those solutions, as well as doing the day job of maintaining cost and savings.
Yeah, I think what's one comment I want to make is I think it's important what Vishal said is that the amount of, call it work, what we have to go do, the things that are required of our organization are continuing to grow. And he highlighted a very important one, regulation. Regulation is becoming very complex, not only in the U.S., but specifically in Europe, with all of these areas. And how do we absorb that? Most organizations today, we may not be cutting within supply management and procurement, but we're certainly not adding a significant amount of resources. And, the study that we just did and we haven't released yet, the projections of what we might add in 2024 is very small. Like 1%, sort of immediate value. So there's certainly going to be people cutting and some adding, but that's a much smaller number than we have seen over the last couple of years. But I think it's important that it's more not about the adding or decreasing, because I don't think we're going to be impacted as much. It's going to be about the allocation. And so as you look at it and say, if I have 100 resources, how best to allocate those in the current environment? And Phil, you earlier on asked me about ROI, and you can look at that in an aggregate level and look at what are we driving as an organization. If we look at the investments we're making, to perform procurement and supply management activities and this capability that we've created for our company, what are we delivering? And again, there's things that we can quantify and things that are less quantifiable as a result of that. And those things are growing. But I think you have to look at it on a more granular basis, even as you look at various categories of spend and say, what is my ROI per category? What is my ROI per event, right? There are going to be areas that we're over-investing in terms of our resources. And, if our expectation in a particular area is a certain amount of value, and I'm looking at the number of resources I have allocated to that, well, maybe I need to rethink that and allocate that to other areas that I can generate higher. But that requires a much more flexible organization than these sort of category structured organizations that don't allow for that flex between categories from a resource standpoint.
Yeah, and a stepping away from the idea of spend under management as being the ultimate metric of a lot of organizations where they see how much control that they have, because I think that's what leads to a lot of these doing a lot of projects which are not value-added projects, but for this sense of, well, at least we're bringing spend under management in doing so. or other ways of defining what that looks like. Kelly, I'm going to come to you in a moment, so thanks for waiting patiently. I have one last kind of follow-up because Vishal mentioned, regulation. You mentioned it as well, Chris, and we talk about ESG. And in the survey, is there anything in the research you did you can observe around the continued importance of ESG topics from a metrics perspective and a value driving perspective? Or is it you talked about cost, is it a cost savings plus, or cost savings replacing other topics of areas of focus that may have been further up that list over the last couple of years?
Yeah. There's a few changes that have occurred, and when we looked at measurements within an organization, you can look at it in a number of different ways. One is just asking procurement organizations, what are you using and what are you looking at as you look at your portfolio of performance measures for the organization? And we've seen that change. I mean, the elevation of corporate social responsibility certainly elevated itself over the last several years. So you're finding that more and more part of what procurement is looking at to report on in terms of other areas that is creating, some enablement to the company, some value, et cetera. And so one of the things that we asked organizations in this study is, what of the things that you're collecting, which areas are being reported up to the senior leaders of your company?
Yeah.
And not surprising, cost and cost avoidance are the top two areas. But right behind that are some of these newer areas that have evolved into our portfolio of measurements, areas around diverse spend and the percentage of spend that is diverse in our organization, areas around sustainability, the things that we're doing from an environmental standpoint, areas around customer satisfaction. So these things have elevated themselves from a reporting standpoint, because what we asked organizations is, what are these areas, a whole list of areas, are you reporting to the top of the organization? But what was also interesting is we asked them, how are you incented? So, we as procurement professionals, we get bonused and based on our performance on an annual basis. And what's interesting about it is that, at the top of what we get bonused on in terms of whether we achieve our targets or not, and get that additional compensation for that, is cost savings and the cost avoidance. But different from what's being reported up, those areas around sustainability and diversity, we're not necessarily driving our bonuses. So yes, it's being driven up to the top of the organization. We're creating much more awareness. Our senior leaders want to know about this, but it's not necessarily driving, and it's not part of our incentive structure to the degree that other measures are. And I'm a firm believer, what gets measured gets done. And so, this is something I think we have to rectify, within the supply management function going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a super good point, Chris. And we've talked about this before, right? Like what the board expects from procurement, but then how it is measured and how performance is evaluated is there's a disconnect. But with I think maybe we talked about this, Phil or Kelly, maybe a couple of years ago, right? I think we had a webinar on sustainability, or at least a discussion on it, and at that point, I was saying that at some point we'll get to a place where on earnings calls, sustainability metrics will be given airtime as well as economic and financial metrics. And I think we're getting pretty close to that. I think we're getting pretty close to that, where, on every 10K, on every company page, on even earnings calls, right? Like people are wanting to talk about what progress they've made, especially if they've made commitments. And that's where, when you've made commitments as a company, that's where your board gets involved, right? Like you've said this, now you need to deliver it. But then there's that gap on who's doing it, how it's being done, how it's being measured. But on that particular topic, I think procurement is actually in the perfect place to do something, especially about Scope 3 emissions. And I was surprised by the Hackett study, because it said that I think 29% were actually either doing something about or measuring tons of carbon, which I think was actually a higher number than I would have thought.
It was 29%.
Yeah. And what was the question again? Was it the metrics that you're measuring? Tons of
Yeah,
progress.
well, we asked organizations to select the measures that they're using to measure responsible procurement.
Yeah, and so I was surprised. That's a pretty good number. I would have imagined it was less actually. So yeah, I think it's going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting, basically no higher than 1/3 of the organizations that participated in any measure selected a particular area, whether it's tons of CO2 or, are you using suppliers that are audited, et cetera. No more than 1/3 in any of those measures of the organizations actually use them. So a lot of, I think there's, sort of like, I think one of the areas that is challenging here, which is different than, say, diverse spend. When we ask that, and we ask of all the measures that are getting reported up, it's the percentage of diverse spend. Anything below that, and that was like 90% of the organizations, but anything other on diverse spend is, like 14%, looking at the impact on local communities, et cetera. But when we look at the responsible procurement and look at sustainability, et cetera, it's a small percentage. So I think we're really trying to sort out what is the most appropriate way to bring quantifiable and credible evidence and awareness of what is happening in our supply chains from a responsible standpoint.
And I mean, this is important because anecdotally, we hear around, this is what a CEO, or this is one of the major areas that a CEO cares about, and is looking for support, is looking for guidance, and is in a way for procurement to actually open that line of communication where some of the traditional things, even like cost savings, it may be a way of communications with the CFO, and the CFO can communicate with the CEO about it. But the CEOs directly care about regulation, sustainability, the impact on investments, the impact on sales, and from a brand reputational perspective. So important area for procurement. Kelly, I think I've taken up probably a lot of time while you wait patiently, so I'm going to hand over.
I do get a gold star for waiting patiently, though. I was very good. But I actually think this is the right time to transition to one of the other things we wanted to talk about, which is, I mean, we've kind of danced around it, but overtly the topic of risk. And Vishal, I actually think it's kind of interesting. I was listening to Chris talk earlier when Phil asked about, how are we measuring procurement's ROI beyond cost savings? I think we can apply that same kind of an idea when we think about shifting mindsets around risk. Are you seeing that after the last couple of years, and whether it's a change in sophistication or it's just a change in priority or amount of time focused, what are some of the changes you're seeing around the way procurement thinks about risk, whether or not we're actually seeing different actions follow on that?
So yeah, I can speak from our customers' sort of experiences. I think so from our standpoint, like we've definitely seen the usage of supplier risk management sort of enabling technologies being used much more in the last couple of years. And it's not so much an an afterthought or a separate thing. It's kind of it's part and parcel of how procurement is evaluating their technology needs. So it's kind of baked in actually in a lot of cases, whether it's a P2P offering or a source to contract offering or the full sort of source to pay type platform. It's something that's a part of all of those evaluations. So that's a positive. I think that procurement is getting a lot better at assessing the plethora of external data that's available on suppliers, together with their internal metrics and internal data from transactions, from spend, from categories, and kind of they're getting better, I think, at putting those two together to come up with a good and I'm going to say a good enough risk profile, because you can, I think, overdo it as well. And it can create a lot of noise, right? Where you're getting alerts about every single thing. But I think that there's a way you can create a good enough risk profile to then make all your other processes that much better and smoother. And I think that those two have to work together. Like, all your core procurement end-to-end processes have to work and be connected to this risk profile or some sort of a risk metric for those things to work better and work smoothly.
Well, and I think that has to be one of those areas where the risk of completely taking us off course again, AI can potentially play a role, right? Because you're talking about, okay, we have to set confidence thresholds, and what are we watching, and what types of risks are we monitoring for? What's our tolerance level? There can be some amount of filtering or pre-programmed screening of news events. What do we just log? What do we escalate and actually ping somebody human to go take a look at? I imagine that supply chain risk might be one of those areas where we start really thinking about concretely applying AI.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But even I just remembered a sort of practical use case. So from one of our customers, they were in a meeting and telling us like, okay, the way we measured our performance on a risk activity was when they were asked by executives like, so what is our exposure to Ukraine or Israel, right? And they were able to respond, and they use this metric as a sort of a feather in their cap, right? They say like, hey, we were able to respond in less than an hour. We were able to respond and say like, these are the suppliers we have here. This is the exposure. These are the different contracts we need to renegotiate or think about or evaluate. And these are the categories and sort of activities that are affected. And they were able to do that in less than an hour. Now,
yeah.
And I think that's a good metric as well, because ultimately you're doing this for a business reason, not for just managing risk. You're doing it for a business reason. And so the person who's requesting that from the business reason, like if they're getting their answer faster, they're happier. And if it takes you 3 days, then that's or a week or 3 weeks, like that's then that's something to think about. So
yeah. And Chris, it's interesting because you were saying before that cost it's never going to disappear, but it had kind of fallen down from a priority standpoint. But you're saying in 2024, look out, it's back, it's big, right? It's going back up to the top of the list. Yeah. I have to think, so much of what most companies have faced over the last few years has been about, okay, what's the focus? Don't do anything humiliating and damaging to the brand. Make sure we have stuff on shelves. Make sure we have service delivery people showing up. Make sure that our transportation works. And so it's not that cost was less important. It's that some of these other things were a little bit more urgent, were taking up more mind space in the C-suite. I'm curious about what you think is going to happen. Again, the shifting mindset idea. As cost comes back to the forefront, is it that cost is popping back into sort of priority one, or is it that there's going to be this friction and tension between cost and risk because those expectations aren't going to change? Inventory still has to be managed, shelf still has to be stocked, services have to be delivered, but now we're trying to do it at the same time as cost is elevating as a priority again. What kind of a dynamic do you think that's going to create, both for procurement and then, of course, the decision makers that we ultimately work with?
Well, it's certainly a friction. And I made a comment, and in some of this, Hackett does research, but I'm also doing research in my own doctoral studies. And, one of the things I've been doing is studying the medical device industry. And, one of the things I looked at is we designed supply networks back in 2019. What are the criteria and how heavily weighted were they as we made those decisions? And I made a comment that cost was by far number one, but it was much more heavily weighted than any of the other considerations in terms of how we selected and architected a supply network. Today that's changed. And so what you saw was, cost came down a bit, but the elevation of things like ensuring that we have continuity. And so what you saw was driving behavior to things like, we'll have two sources of supply, right? Instead of just being dependent on one geography, we're going to have two geographies or two suppliers, et cetera. And what that has done is, potentially in some cases, introduce some additional cost back into the equation. But we were willing to do that when we could not get supply. Yeah. Well, we're now in an environment where margin is absolutely critical in our organizations. Revenues are, more muted, in terms of the growth of them in the current environment. So there's a lot more pressure to put cost And so, I've had, leaders of procurement tell me, so, well, Chris, it's sort of like we went back and everyone was a little bit okay with the cost going up a little bit based on the fact that we were protecting our revenue. Mm-hmm. Today, they still want that, but they want the cost back to where they were, several years ago. So how do we do that? And I think you're going to see some of this tension occur, as we start to figure that out. I think it's also important that a lot of these technologies are being introduced at the same time, the generative AI, et cetera, which, certainly give us capabilities to be able to potentially do this. But the last thing I would say is that risk is, and you talk specifically about risk, as you mentioned, there are like many different elements of risk, whether it's the continuity and protecting revenue, whether it be information and cybersecurity, whether it be reputational risk, et cetera, the financial risk. There's all these different types. So not only has risk in the way that we view it broadened significantly in terms of what we have to worry about, but it's also become much more deep. And so what you're finding is organizations are needing to have visibility to risk much deeper in their supply chains. It's not good enough to only have that visibility at tier 1, because what we found is that a lot of these challenges were occurring deeper in the supply chain. They were there and they were surprises to us. We just didn't know it. So how do we get that more predictive insight in terms of what is happening deeper out there? And this is going to create a massive amount of not only effort, but data. Think about the regulatory risks that we have today. It's just mind-numbing in terms of the number of regulations that are coming, not only being introduced on a country-by-country basis in all the different geographies. It's just, how do you manage all of that? So it's a massive data issue.
Yeah. And to that point, maybe one last question, then I know we have a couple of other points we want to try to get to. If I can ask you about, your comment, Chris, that if you're not measuring it, you can't manage it, and therefore it's not going to happen. We can certainly create these enormous pools of data, but I think of procurement's ability to impact or at least better understand risk as part of that value creation opportunity. How are we doing around the measurement of risk? I mean, we have information about, where are we currently, or where does a disruption is maybe pending, but how are we doing specifically around our measurement capabilities when it comes to helping the organization understand the shifting sands around risk?
Yeah. Well, that was one of the questions in our survey as well, because one of the things that we did is not only try to uncover, what's happening, just, we talked about cost savings and ROI, et cetera, but also the different types of measures, whether it be diversity measures that have been introduced into our performance scorecards, sustainability measures, but risk as well. And, risk is one of those things that is difficult to measure. And, one of the things that you would find organizations would look at, especially when it comes to continuity of supply, is what level of revenue do we have at risk, or what level of margin do we have at risk? And so we go through every category of spend and we look at, based on, these particular suppliers, how much revenue are they connected to? And is that supplier who's only supplying us $150,000 of whatever, per year, but they're attached and they're critical to $3 billion of our revenue, and they're at high risk because they're a single supplier, a single location sitting on a volcano in the Philippines? That's a concern, because now I have $3 billion of revenue that's at risk. So we want to uncover that as we go through. And so doing that. But when we ask organizations, what is the most common way they're measuring risk? It's using a composite risk index. And so it's just basically setting a baseline and looking at a number of different factors of risk, and then using that and basically saying, based on this baseline, how far are we moving away from that baseline? Have we done things to mitigate? And if we look at that composite risk index, and let's say 5 is highest risk, 1 is lowest risk, we're at a 4 right now. But based on doing these mitigation strategies, because that would kick off a set of, here's where the risk is. Now, what are the mitigation strategies we're going to go do to actually mitigate that? And then we can reassign that risk index. Now, it gives us a sense that, hey, we're moving in a direction that we're lowering the level of risk based on these factors. What it doesn't do is guarantee that nothing's going to happen, because there's always things that I like to say, those unpredictable areas. COVID, you would have looked at COVID, not the pandemic itself, but the impact that it had on the world, the fact that the entire world shut down. Nobody predicted that. I mean, we all predicted. I mean, there's all kinds of discussions around whether a pandemic, we talked about it. Bill Gates was talking about it back in 2007. Yeah. We knew these things were possibilities, but not the possibility that we'd shut down the economies of the entire globe. That was not predictable. And so how do you protect yourself in a risk standpoint against that? So today, people are using risk indexes. They're still using the financial, types of risk. But it's not 100% of organizations. It is something lower than that.
Yeah, and I'll just comment sort of as I hand back to you, Phil. It's interesting. You certainly can't expect that we're going to be able to mitigate all risk, especially not when you're thinking about something as broad and disastrous as the pandemic. But it certainly does require us to call into question some of the easy, comfortable techniques of the past, like Pareto, right? Well, I feel pretty good about 80% of my spend. It could be a 0.5% supplier that brings your entire production line to a halt. And so it maybe some of those tools, not in all cases, but especially when it comes to a critically identified type of risk, some of those things where we have to say, okay, procurement, it's time to get a little more nuanced, a little more specific, and dig deeper than that. But it's that desire to continue learning and being able to do better around our processes and approaches that I think is a lesson we can take away from the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think the other big lesson is that we can't rely on our tier ones to be taking care of the tier 2, tier 3, et cetera.
Yeah.
One of the things that was just very surprising to me is the lack of awareness, the lack of visibility beyond that, and the reliance on tier ones to provide the comfort that everything was being taken care of. And so what I've seen is that's the sort of where it was in 2019.
Yeah.
Today, it's not an option for us not to have visibility and some kind of influence across multiple tiers of our overall supply chain in the most critical areas.
Now, it's funny, Kelly and I were just talking this morning about a case where there's one company who filed bankruptcy because of the failure of a single supplier. They have a single source, key category. It brought down the whole organization. And that just shows, the risk that can exist within the supply chain and supply base for any organization. Now, I know we've only got a couple of minutes to go, and there's a number of different areas and rabbit holes that I could jump down. But Vishal, I think just to wrap things up, I'm going to bring you in for a quick answer, and also for Chris as well, if we're able to get both of your perspective in. But I'd just like to, kind of sum up all the things that we've been talking about today. From your perspective, Vishal, some of the things that you see with your client base, what are the kind of the best of the best doing to ensure that procurement's associated with value that's not just savings?
Yeah, I think what we find in sort of the leading or even more mature customers is that one, that they have a procurement roadmap, right? And it's not, and I don't mean a technology roadmap for procurement. I mean just where they want their own organization to go.
Like a business plan, a procurement business plan.
Yeah. And then all of the other things that need to support that growth of procurement, if you want to call it growth. But it's like, so, and in some cases it's, one specific example is IKEA. There's some others, but IKEA, they have as a company, like a very big objective for sustainability, right? So on their roadmap was like, we need to be the best at sustainability in, as a procurement organization, as IKEA, because that's what's expected. And they're able to go into tier 2, tier 3 supply chain and tell you like which suppliers supplied which wood for every piece of furniture, right? But they're doing it at like a degree that very, not many would be able to do, I think. But then there's others which have said, okay, we need to, expand from just, and I know we didn't touch on this, but the direct versus indirect spend area, right? Like we need to expand the influence of procurement from just indirect spend to this new area, or we need to combine or, just support or some way And so there are different things, but I think that roadmap helps because then you also can fill the talent, you can fill the gaps that you have, you know where you're going, you know which objectives you have to hit, whether it's sustainability or direct spend or compliance or whatever those are. But I think that's one common theme that I've seen across those customers.
Interesting. Well, I know it's the top of the hour. So as I said right at the beginning, I could sense that we'd have a lot more to talk about than we had time available. I see some questions came in as well, and I apologize that we really don't have the time to jump on those and ask some follow-ups. So all that really remains to be said is that, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for listening in to Chris and Vishal share their knowledge and experience with us. And Vishal and Chris, thank you so much for your time as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
I enjoyed the discussion.
And we had the question, where can I get a Love Procurement hoodie? Well, as we said right at the very top that there will be 3 randomly selected attendees who will get the T-shirt version of the hoodie. So
maybe hoodies next time.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining again. Thanks, Vishal, and thanks, Chris, and thanks, Kelly, as well.